The story of the Reconquista is one of the longest and most defining struggles in European history. It spans nearly 8 centuries, from the early 700s to 1492, and represents not only a political and military campaign, but also a profound cultural and religious transformation. It is the tale of how Christian kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula gradually reclaimed territories conquered by Muslim forces and, in the process, forged the identity of modern Spain. When Muslim armies from North Africa invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 711 CE, they initiated an era of rule that would profoundly shape the history, religion, and culture of Europe. The conquest of the Visigothic kingdom was swift. Led by the Berber general Brik ibn Ziyad, under the command of the Umayyad Caliphate, Islamic forces defeated King Roderick of the Visigoths at the Battle of Guadalete. Within a few years, nearly the entire peninsula had fallen under Muslim control, forming what came to be known as Al-Andalus. The early period of Muslim rule was characterized by remarkable political and cultural achievements. The Umayyad Emirate, later the Caliphate of Cordoba, transformed the region into one of the most advanced and cosmopolitan societies of the medieval world. Cities such as Cordoba, Seville, and Granada became centers of learning, architecture, and trade. Under Muslim governance, Jews and Christians were tolerated as people of the book, although they lived as second-class citizens under dhimmi status, paying special taxes and lacking certain rights. Despite this, coexistence among Muslims, Christians, and Jews allowed for the flourishing of art, science, and philosophy, leaving an enduring legacy in European intellectual history. Yet, from the moment the Visigothic kingdom fell, resistance to Muslim rule began in the northern mountainous regions of Iberia. There, small Christian communities survived, protected by the rugged terrain of Asturias and Cantabria. In 718, a local leader named Paleo Pelagius defeated a Muslim force at the Battle of Covadonga. Though small in scale, this event later took on legendary significance as the symbolic beginning of the Reconquest date, Christian reconquest of Spain. During the next 2 centuries, the Christian presence in the north consolidated into several small but enduring kingdoms: Asturias, León, Navarre, Castile, and Aragon. Their populations were composed of refugees, remnants of Visigothic nobility, and Christian peasants seeking freedom from Muslim authority. The process of expansion southward was slow and intermittent, shaped by local geography, political alliances, and shifting fortunes within both Christian and Muslim realms. By the 10th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba had reached its zenith. It rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople in splendor, boasting advanced irrigation systems, libraries, and centers of translation that preserved and expanded Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. Christian rulers, while militarily weaker, maintained diplomatic and trade relations with Al-Andalus, and cultural exchange was common. However, internal divisions would soon undermine Muslim unity. The fragmentation of Al-Andalus into smaller states, known as Tifus, following the collapse of the Caliphate in 1031, provided the Christian kingdoms with new opportunities for conquest. No longer faced with a single powerful enemy, Christian rulers exploited Muslim rivalries by forming alliances and demanding tribute in exchange for military protection. This system of tribute, known as parias, brought wealth to Christian courts and financed further expansion. The 11th century also witnessed the growing influence of religious ideology in the Reconquista as the Christian kingdoms advanced. Their struggle came to be framed not merely as a territorial recovery, but as a holy war for Christendom. The papacy encouraged this view, linking the Iberian campaigns with the wider crusading movement that began in the Holy Land. The reconquest of Muslim lands was seen as part of the same spiritual mission to defend and expand Christianity. A major turning point came with the reign of Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon, who captured Toledo in 1085. Toledo, once the Visigothic capital, was both strategically and symbolically vital. Its fall signaled the growing strength of the Christian north and the beginning of the end for Muslim dominance. However, the success of the Christians also provoked a strong reaction from the Muslim world. The Almoravids, a puritanical Berber dynasty from North Africa, crossed into Iberia to defend Islam. They temporarily halted Christian expansion, restoring unity to Al-Andalus and infusing the region with renewed religious zeal. Yet even the Almoravids could not prevent the gradual erosion of Muslim power. By the 12th century, the Almohads, another reformist Berber movement, had supplanted them but faced internal disunity and resistance. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms continued to grow stronger, both militarily and politically. Castile and Leon expanded their territories southward, while Aragon and Navarre consolidated control over the eastern frontier. Portugal emerged as an independent kingdom, recognized by the papacy in 1179, further contributing to the Christian momentum. The defining moment of the Reconquista came in 1212, with the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. A coalition of Christian forces from Castile, Aragon, and Navarre dealt a decisive defeat to the Almohads, breaking their military power in Iberia. The victory opened vast territories in southern Spain to Christian conquest and marked the beginning of the final phase of the Reconquest. Over the next 2 centuries, the Christian kingdoms pushed steadily southward, capturing major cities such as Córdoba, 1236, Valencia 1238, and Seville. By the mid-13th century, Muslim control was reduced to the Emirate of Granada in the far south, which survived as a vassal state under Castilian suzerainty. The gradual Christian expansion was accompanied by significant social and cultural transformation. The repopulation or repoblación of reconquered lands brought settlers from the north into newly captured territories. Christian monarchs granted privileges, lands, and municipal charters to encourage migration and secure loyalty. The diverse population of Iberia, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, contributed to a complex society where coexistence was sometimes tolerated, though often fragile. Conversion, intermarriage, and cultural exchange produced hybrid forms of art and architecture, such as the Mudéjar style, which blended Islamic and Christian motifs. The political consolidation of Spain accelerated during the late Middle Ages. The marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile in 1469 united the 2 largest Christian kingdoms, creating a powerful dynastic alliance. Their reign symbolized both the culmination of the Reconquista and the dawn of a new era of Spanish unity, driven by religious zeal and a vision of national unification. Ferdinand and Isabella launched the final campaign against Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. After a protracted war lasting from 1482 to 1492, Granada fell to the Christian forces. On January 2, 1492, the last Nasrid ruler, Boabdil Muhammad XII, surrendered the keys of the city to the Catholic monarchs. The Reconquista was complete. Spain had achieved not only territorial unification, but also religious consolidation under Christianity. The same year witnessed 2 other monumental events: the expulsion of Jews under the Alhambra decree, and the voyage of Christopher Columbus, which initiated Spain's global empire. The victory of Christianity and the unification of Spain came at a profound cost. The religious pluralism that had once characterized medieval Iberia gave way to intolerance and persecution. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition sought to enforce religious orthodoxy, targeting converts from Judaism and Islam suspected of heresy. The forced conversions and expulsions that followed eliminated much of the intellectual and cultural diversity that had defined Al-Andalus. Spain emerged as a centralized Catholic monarchy, bound by a sense of divine mission that would shape its imperial ambitions for centuries to come. Historically, the Reconquista represents both a political achievement and a cultural paradox. On one hand, it united the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule and gave rise to one of Europe's most powerful states. On the other, it extinguished centuries of coexistence and intellectual exchange that had enriched medieval civilization. The same forces that inspired unity and faith also produced exclusion and conformity. The legacy of the Reconquista endures in Spain's architecture, language, and national identity. The Gothic cathedrals built upon former mosques, the Arabic words that remain embedded in Spanish vocabulary, and the legends of heroic knights such as El Cid all testify to the complex interplay of cultures that shaped Iberian history. The Reconquista was not a simple crusade of good versus evil, but a multifaceted process of resistance, adaptation, and transformation that reflected the broader dynamics of medieval Europe. In retrospect, the Reconquista stands as one of the defining movements of the Middle Ages. It bridged the ancient and modern worlds, linking the fall of Rome to the rise of the Renaissance. It united a continent under Christian ideals, while setting the stage for European exploration and colonization. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the enduring power of belief, how faith, identity, and persistence could reshape the destiny of nations. The Christian victory and the unification of Spain in 1492 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The cross replaced the crescent over Granada, symbolizing both triumph and transition. From the ashes of centuries of conflict rose a nation that would carry its faith, its language, and its ambitions across oceans to the New World. The Reconquista had ended, but its spirit of resilience, devotion, and destiny continued to define Spain's role in history. The conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763 marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. The war had expanded British territory, but also exposed the empire's financial and administrative limitations. Britain's national debt nearly doubled, and the cost of defending its far-flung dominions appeared unsustainable without additional revenue. London officials concluded that the colonies, whose security had been ensured through British victory, should contribute more directly to imperial expenses. Yet, what seemed to Parliament a reasonable policy of fiscal reform appeared to the colonists as an attack on their autonomy. The decade following 1763 became a contest between imperial authority and colonial liberty, a conflict fought not only with weapons, but with words, laws, and principles. The first sign of this shift came with the Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Its purpose was to prevent further warfare with native nations after Pontiac's rebellion, and to organize Western lands. But to many colonists, especially land speculators and frontier settlers, it felt like a betrayal. They had fought and died for the right to expand, and now the crown was denying them the spoils of victory. The boundary line, though poorly enforced, symbolized a new imperial restraint that clashed with colonial aspirations. More serious confrontation followed with Britain's effort to reform colonial taxation. The Sugar Act of 1764 lowered duties on molasses, but imposed stricter enforcement, signaling an end to the laxity that had characterized previous decades. A year later, Parliament enacted the Stamp Act, requiring that legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials carry a revenue stamp. The law struck directly at the daily business of the colonies and affected every class. What inflamed resentment was not merely the cost, but the principle. Parliament had levied a direct tax on the colonies without their consent. Colonial assemblies had long claimed the right to tax their own constituents, a right rooted in English constitutional tradition. The rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," expressed a belief that liberty depended upon self-government, and that a distant legislature, in which colonists had no voice, could not legitimately tax them. The response was immediate and coordinated. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Artisans and laborers formed protest groups, known as the Sons of Liberty. And intellectuals articulated a philosophy of rights grounded in natural law and the British Constitution. In October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies convened in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, issuing a Declaration of Rights and Grievances that asserted the colonies' loyalty to the Crown, but denied Parliament's authority to tax them without representation. This transcolonial cooperation, though cautious, signaled the emergence of a shared political identity. Confronted with widespread resistance and economic disruption, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, reaffirming its right to legislate in all cases whatsoever. The underlying issue of sovereignty remained unresolved. Tensions eased briefly, but reignited with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on imported glass, paper, paint, and tea. The revenue was intended to pay royal officials in the colonies, thereby freeing them from dependence on colonial assemblies. This subtle shift threatened to undermine local self-government. Once again, non-importation agreements spread through the colonies, and protests became increasingly organized. Writers such as John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, argued that even indirect taxes violated constitutional principles if their purpose was revenue rather than regulation. British troops were dispatched to Boston to maintain order, an action that only inflamed resentment. Clashes between civilians and soldiers culminated in the Boston Massacre of 1770, when 5 colonists were killed. Though Parliament soon repealed most of the Townshend duties, the symbolic tax on tea remained, a reminder of imperial authority. The next crisis arose from the attempt to rescue the struggling East India Company by granting it a monopoly on the colonial tea trade. The Tea Act of 1773 lowered the price of British tea, but asserted Parliament's right to tax it. Many colonists viewed the act as a trick designed to make them accept unconstitutional taxation. In December 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This Boston Tea Party was both protest and provocation. To British ministers, it was an intolerable act of defiance. To colonists, it was a dramatic assertion of principle. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts of 1774, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These measures closed Boston's port, altered the Massachusetts Charter, allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, and authorized the quartering of troops in private homes. In the same year, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, extending the boundaries of Quebec and granting toleration to Catholics, legislation that colonists interpreted as favoritism toward despotism and a threat to Protestant liberty. Together, these acts convinced many Americans that the British government intended to destroy their freedoms. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, marking the first truly continental political gathering in American history. The delegates were not yet united around independence. They sought reconciliation based on the restoration of their rights. They issued a Declaration of Rights, endorsed a boycott of British goods, and agreed to reconvene if grievances were not redressed. Beneath these cautious resolutions, however, a revolutionary infrastructure was forming. Local committees of correspondence and safety coordinated enforcement of the boycotts and mobilized militias. A sense of American solidarity, born of shared resistance, began to replace provincial loyalties. By the spring of 1775, compromise had collapsed. British troops in Boston received orders to seize colonial military supplies stored at Concord, Massachusetts. On April 19, the Redcoats encountered colonial militiamen on the village green at Lexington. A shot was fired, source unknown, and chaos followed. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord left several dead and marked the beginning of armed conflict. News of the battle spread rapidly, electrifying the colonies. Farmers, tradesmen, and merchants alike took up arms. What had begun as a dispute over taxes had erupted into war. The Second Continental Congress, convening in May 1775, faced the daunting task of directing this spontaneous rebellion. It appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army and sought ways to finance the struggle. Petitions for peace were still sent to the king, but they went unanswered. The publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in early 1776 transformed the debate. Written in plain, powerful language, Paine's pamphlet argued that monarchy itself was an absurd and corrupt institution, and that independence was not only desirable but inevitable. His words gave moral clarity to what had seemed unthinkable, a complete break from Britain. By midsummer 1776, the momentum for separation was overwhelming. On July 4, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration justified rebellion as a defense of natural rights against tyranny, listing grievances against King George III to prove that he had violated the social contract. Beyond its immediate political function, it articulated a universal philosophy that would inspire movements for freedom across the world. The Declaration transformed a colonial rebellion into an ideological revolution. Yet independence had to be secured on the battlefield. The British, possessing the world's most powerful army and navy, expected a quick victory. The Americans, poorly trained and supplied, relied on determination and local support. Early defeats in New York forced Washington's army into retreat. But his daring counterattack at Trenton in December 1776 revived morale. The war became a test of endurance. Britain's strategy sought to isolate New England, assumed to be the center of radicalism. But the capture of Philadelphia and other victories failed to crush the rebellion. The turning point came in 1777, with the American victory at Saratoga, where General Horatio Gates's forces forced the surrender of a British army under Burgoyne. The triumph convinced France that the American cause was viable. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, transforming the conflict into a global war that stretched British resources thin. Spanish and Dutch support followed, further isolating Britain diplomatically. Meanwhile, the hardships at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-78 tested the army's resilience, but also forged discipline under the training of Baron von Steuben. The revolutionary struggle was sustained by ideology as much as arms. The promise of liberty and republican virtue kept the cause alive when material prospects seemed hopeless. In the Southern Theater, where Britain hoped to rally loyalists and exploit slave labor, the fighting became brutal and partisan. Battles at King's Mountain, Cowpens, and Guildford Courthouse weakened British control. Finally, in 1781, combined American and French forces trapped General Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, Virginia. Surrounded by Washington's troops on land and the French fleet at sea, Cornwallis surrendered. The war effectively ended, though peace negotiations continued for 2 more years. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence and granted the new nation generous boundaries stretching to the Mississippi River. The victory was astonishing given the imbalance of power. It owed much to foreign alliances, British miscalculations, and the colonists' ability to sustain a political vision amid hardship. Yet independence brought new challenges. The colonies, now states, had to transform revolutionary ideals into stable governance. Their first experiment, the Articles of Confederation, created a loose league of friendship with limited central authority. The arrangement preserved liberty but proved inadequate for managing debts, diplomacy, and interstate conflicts. Out of this weakness would arise a stronger federal union. But that chapter belonged to the next stage of the American story. What the revolution had accomplished by 1783 was more than national separation. It had reshaped ideas of sovereignty and citizenship. In the minds of many Americans, government was no longer a gift from kings, but a trust derived from the people. The meaning of freedom, however, remained contested. Slavery persisted, women's rights were limited, and native nations faced continued dispossession. The promise of equality proclaimed in 1776 would require generations of struggle to approach fulfillment. Still, the transformation from colonies to freedom marked a profound shift in human history. The 13 colonies that had once viewed themselves as extensions of Britain now stood as an independent republic, founded on Enlightenment principles. Their success demonstrated that revolution could achieve not chaos, but creation a new order, grounded in reason, representation, and rights. The ideals born in that age would echo through subsequent revolutions, inspiring peoples from France to Latin America and beyond. Thus, the journey from dependency to independence was neither simple nor inevitable. It was shaped by economic grievance, political evolution, intellectual ferment, and the lived experience of generations who believed that liberty was worth the risk of everything. The American Revolution closed one chapter of empire and opened another in the history of democracy. The colonies had become a nation. The subjects had become citizens. The birth of America was not merely the founding of a state, but the creation of an enduring ideal. That freedom, once awakened, cannot easily be contained. The Reconquista stands not only as a series of wars, but as one of the most formative psychological and philosophical movements in Western civilization. It reshaped Europe's understanding of faith, nationhood, and the human relationship to divine destiny. Its influence extended beyond the Iberian Peninsula, echoing through the political, cultural, and religious life of the modern world. The unification of Spain under Christianity was both the end of a medieval cycle and the birth of a new global order. The philosophical foundations of the Reconquista were rooted in the medieval synthesis of religion and politics. The alliance of crown and church that characterized Iberian society reflected a worldview in which temporal power and divine will were intertwined. Kings ruled, not merely by inheritance or conquest, but by perceived divine mandate. The success of Christian arms was interpreted as evidence of God's favor, while setbacks were viewed as punishments for sin. This spiritual interpretation of history gave the Reconquista its enduring moral intensity. In the context of medieval Christendom, the Reconquista became a central narrative of resistance and redemption. It symbolized the defense of Christian civilization against Islam, which, since the rise of the Umayyads, had challenged European dominance in science, philosophy, and trade. The fall of Toledo in 1085 and the capture of Granada in 1492 were celebrated not only as political victories, but as moments of cosmic justice, a reversal of the Islamic conquests that had once extended into southern France and threatened the heart of Europe. This perception of sacred struggle would later influence the broader phenomenon of the Crusades. The idea that warfare could be sanctified, transformed from an act of violence into an act of faith, was both revolutionary and dangerous. It provided moral justification for aggression and expansion, while also binding European identity to the defense of Christianity. The Reconquista, in this sense, was not an isolated event, but part of a larger historical continuum that linked medieval piety with imperial ambition. The intellectual consequences of this worldview were profound. The long coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus had created one of the most intellectually fertile regions of the Middle Ages. The transmission of classical Greek philosophy through Arabic translations, the development of algebra and astronomy, and the flourishing of poetry and architecture all passed through Iberia into the rest of Europe. Ironically, the very movement that sought to eradicate Islamic presence also absorbed much of its intellectual legacy. The Christian scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries, especially those working in the school of translators in Toledo, played a crucial role in the rediscovery of Aristotle and other ancient thinkers. These translations influenced figures such as Thomas Aquinas, whose synthesis of reason and faith became a cornerstone of Christian philosophy. Thus, even as the Reconquista sought to purify the peninsula religiously, it facilitated the exchange of knowledge that helped lay the groundwork for the European Renaissance. However, as the Reconquista approached its conclusion, the intellectual openness of earlier centuries gave way to a more rigid orthodoxy. The trauma of centuries of conflict produced an intense desire for unity and security, which the Catholic monarchs and their successors sought to enforce through religious conformity. The Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, and the censorship of heterodox ideas all reflected a society that equated diversity with danger. The intellectual pluralism that had once defined Iberia was replaced by a singular identity: Catholic, Spanish, and Royalist. This transformation was both a strength and a weakness. It provided Spain with the cohesion necessary to project power abroad, but it also limited its adaptability at home. The same zeal that fueled the Reconquista drove the conquest of the Americas. Yet it also stifled scientific and philosophical innovation within Spain itself. While the rest of Europe moved toward the Enlightenment, Spain remained bound to its medieval synthesis of faith and authority. The cultural psychology of post-Reconquista Spain was deeply marked by its centuries-long struggle. The Spanish sense of destiny of being chosen by God to uphold the true faith became a defining national myth. This conviction imbued Spain's imperial expansion with a moral purpose, transforming conquest into crusade. The Spanish kings of the 16th century, particularly Charles V and Philip II, viewed themselves as defenders of Christendom against heresy and infidelity. The wars against Protestantism in Europe and the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean were seen as continuations of the same divine mission that had begun in Asturias 8 centuries earlier. This messianic vision had both noble and tragic consequences. It produced extraordinary achievements in art, architecture, and exploration, but it also fostered intolerance and rigidity. The spiritual triumph of the Reconquista gradually hardened into dogma. Spain's political decline in the 17th century coincided with the erosion of the religious unity that had once sustained it. The same faith that had united a divided peninsula now constrained its evolution in an age that demanded flexibility and innovation. From a philosophical perspective, the Reconquista illustrates the paradox of unity achieved through exclusion. The pursuit of oneness, whether religious, cultural, or political affon, requires the suppression of difference. In medieval Spain, the ideal of one faith, one king, one law created stability but extinguished diversity. The tragedy of the Reconquista is not merely the suffering it caused, but the loss of the pluralistic spirit that had made Iberia a bridge between civilizations. Yet, history rarely conforms to simple moral categories. The Reconquista also demonstrated the resilience of human communities and the capacity of faith to inspire endurance. For nearly 8 centuries, generation after generation of Christians maintained their belief in restoration, despite overwhelming odds. This continuity of purpose, this long memory of loss and hope represents one of the most remarkable examples of collective will in world history. In the broader context of European civilization, the Reconquista helped define the concept of Christendom as a geopolitical and spiritual entity. It reinforced the boundaries between Europe and the Islamic world, shaping Western identity in opposition to the other. This binary perception, Christian versus Muslim, Europe versus Eastward, later informed colonial and Orientalist attitudes. The global expansion of Europe after 1492 carried with it the legacy of these medieval conflicts, embedding notions of religious and cultural superiority in the structures of empire. At the same time, the Reconquista's end in 1492 coincided with the beginning of modern globalization. The unification of Spain provided the resources and stability necessary for overseas exploration. The voyages of Columbus and later conquistadors were not accidents of geography, but continuations of a centuries-old pattern of conquest and conversion. The banners that had been raised over Granada were soon planted in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Peru. The New World became the stage upon which Spain reenacted the drama of the Reconquista on a planetary scale. The moral complexity of this legacy continues to shape historical debate. To some, the Reconquista represents a heroic defense of faith and civilization against invasion. To others, it stands as a warning against fanaticism and cultural destruction. Both interpretations contain truth. The Reconquista cannot be reduced to simple categories of right or wrong. It must be understood as a dynamic process in which competing ideals, faith and tolerance, unity and diversity, strength and compassion clashed and combined. The intellectual descendants of this period, both in Spain and abroad, continued to grapple with its meaning. In the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu criticized Spain's religious rigidity as the cause of its decline, contrasting it with the rationalism of Northern Europe. Yet Romantic thinkers of the 19th century rediscovered the Reconquista as a source of national pride and identity. The figure of El Cid, once a medieval knight, became a symbol of patriotism. The ruins of the Alhambra inspired poets and painters, who saw in them the beauty of a lost world and the melancholy of time's passage. Modern historians view the Reconquista as both a destructive and creative force, crucible in which Spain's complex identity was forged. It produced a nation deeply conscious of its history, faith, and destiny. It also contributed to the broader European transition from medieval fragmentation to centralized statehood. The methods of administration, taxation, and military organization developed during the Reconquista laid the groundwork for the modern Spanish state. Beyond Spain, the concept of reconquest has echoed through history in other contexts. It has been invoked by nationalist movements seeking to reclaim lost territories or identities. It has been used to justify wars, colonization, and religious revival. The enduring power of the term reflects the universal human longing for restoration, for the recovery of what is believed to have been taken or lost. In this sense, the Reconquista is not only a Spanish story, but a human one. Culturally, its influence endures in Spain's language, art, and collective memory. The coexistence of Christian and Islamic motifs in architecture, the persistence of Arabic vocabulary in Spanish, and the haunting melodies of Andalusian music all testify to the interwoven legacies of conquest and coexistence. The Reconquista ended the political presence of Islam in Iberia, but it could not erase its imprint on Spanish civilization. In a philosophical sense, the Reconquista also raises timeless questions about the relationship between faith and reason, power and morality. Can a struggle for belief ever be separated from ambition? Can unity be achieved without oppression? These questions, born of medieval Iberia, continue to resonate in the modern world. The same dynamics that shaped the Reconquista, religious zeal, cultural identity, and the tension between inclusion and exclusion reappear in contemporary conflicts across nations and ideologies. Ultimately, the Reconquista's greatest legacy may lie not in its victories but in its lessons. It reveals the danger of defining identity solely through opposition, and the cost of equating purity with virtue. Yet it also demonstrates the enduring power of conviction, the ability of human beings to sustain hope across centuries. The Reconquista began as a defense of faith, but became a mirror of the human condition, our capacity for creation and destruction, for devotion and intolerance, for unity and division. The unification of Spain under Christianity was both a culmination and a contradiction. It fulfilled the medieval dream of reconquest, but also ended the age of coexistence that had produced one of the richest cultural syntheses in history. It gave birth to a nation destined to shape the modern world, yet burdened with the weight of its own absolutism. From the mountains of Asturias to the palaces of Granada, from the fields of Las Navas to Tolosa to the cathedrals of Seville, the echoes of the Reconquista continue to remind us that history's victories are never simple. The fall of Granada in 1492 thus stands as both an end and a beginning. It ended the Islamic presence in Western Europe, but began the European presence across the world. It closed the medieval chapter of Christendom, but opened the global age of empire. It achieved unity through faith, but raised questions about the meaning of freedom, diversity, and truth. The cross that rose over the Alhambra that day symbolized more than conquest. It marked the moment when Europe turned from inward struggle to outward expansion. The Reconquista's legacy, then, is not confined to Spain alone. It belongs to the history of humanity's eternal search for belonging and belief. It reminds us that every unification leaves behind a shadow, and every victory carries the memory of what was lost. In its triumphs and tragedies, in its faith and its flaws, The Reconquista embodies the paradox of civilization itself, that in seeking to build a perfect order, we reveal both the glory and the limits of human endeavor.